Hey guys, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge, where people get what they deserve and sometimes more. So be sure to like and subscribe, and we're getting right into it. Roommates stopped contributing, so we left them with nothing. This happened during my junior year of college. I, Claire, lived with 5 other women. I'll call them Abby, Brooke, Danny, Ella, and Fran. When we signed the lease on the house, we agreed to a 1-year deal, June 1st to May 31st. The house was off-campus and unfurnished, so we needed things to make it feel like home. Prior to moving in, we all sat down and decided what we needed for the house, and who was going to bring what, and also settled on a chore schedule. We also decided that we'd have a household supply fund set up, so we could buy things we all would use, like toilet paper, paper towels, dish detergent, and laundry detergent. As it turns out, Danny, Ella, Francesca, and I bought most of the stuff we needed, like a couch, small dining table, dishes, silverware, drinking glasses, cookware, food storage containers, etc. Things went pretty well during fall semester. Shortly after that, however, things started to decline. Abby's boyfriend, Andy, basically moved in with us, and the two of them started acting like they owned the place. Left a dirty dish in the sink, they'd leave a passive-aggressive note about how rude it was to do that. Come home after the library closed at midnight, Abby and Andy went to bed at 10, and if you woke them up, there was hell to pay. Pretty soon, Brooke and her boyfriend, Brad, were acting in much the same way. By early February, it was clear to Danny, Ella, Fran, and me that we did not want to live with Abby and Brooke another year. The 4 of us found a different off-campus place and signed a lease. We let Abby and Brooke know, and from then on, the 2 of them, plus their boyfriends, went from partial jerks to complete jerks. They'd do things like stop the clothes washer mid-wash, take our clothes out, dump them on the floor, and start their own laundry. They'd use up all the hot water by taking super long showers. They'd write return to sender on our mail. They destroyed flowers our boyfriends sent or brought to us. They refused packages. They stopped contributing to the shared supply fund and stopped doing chores. About a week before Memorial Day, Ella got a call from the landlord on our new place, saying the previous tenants had moved out, and we could move in early if we'd like at no charge. Danny, Ella, Fran, and I discussed it, and decided to get out of our current house ASAP, but didn't tell Abby and Brooke of our plans. Memorial Day weekend rolls around, and Abby, Brooke, and their boyfriends head out of town to go camping, while the rest of us put our plan into action. With the help of friends, Danny, Ella, Fran, and I got all of our stuff moved out. And when I say all, I mean all. Living room furniture, dining room furniture, dishes, silverware, cookware, food storage containers, baking supplies, shower curtain, rugs, lamps, vacuum, broom, dustpan, etc. We also decided that since neither Abby nor Brooke had contributed to the shared household supply fund since March, the toilet paper, paper towels, dish detergent, laundry detergent, and so forth was ours. So we took all of that too. Abby, Brooke, and their boyfriends were shocked to return from their camping trip to an empty house. What made our petty revenge even sweeter was that on their way home from the camping trip, all 4 of them got food poisoning and were really sick. The scathing texts we got about moving out unannounced and taking all the shared household goods, especially the toilet paper, priceless. Danny, Ella, Fran, and I are great friends and still get a good laugh about the situation about 12 years later. None of us have heard from Abby or Brooke since graduation. This is exactly why having roommates is awful, in my opinion. And the more people you have shacked up together, the more likely it is that at least one of them is going to be an awful roommate. And when you have so many people sharing the costs of the bills evenly, then that usually makes it so that the most frugal person in the house is not only paying for themselves, but also pays for part of the most wasteful person in the house. If that kind of makes sense, at least in terms of college roommates and friends. Now here's a super petty and short one for ya. A poisoned apple. A story from my days as a grad student in chemistry, late 1984 or early 1985, reporting a revenge dispensed by another. First-year chemistry grad students shared a large multi-desk office that included a refrigerator for storing food, no chemicals. One morning, one of the other students discovered that overnight, an apple he was keeping in the refrigerator had been stolen. After asking around to determine that none of us had taken it, he devised a revenge. He left a note in the refrigerator saying, as best as I remember all these years later, "The apple you stole yesterday had malic acid in it. You mess with the chemist at your own peril." The next day, a night janitor reported to the health center, stating he had been poisoned, but no punishment was meted out to the grad student poisoner. Malic acid is the naturally occurring chemical that makes apples taste tart, and the apple had not been adulterated. You mess with a chemist at your own peril. A fitting twist. I had a pretty terrible childhood. Don't get me wrong, I've heard of way worse, but it was far from healthy or normal. When I was young, my parents were millionaires, my father's parents owning several of the largest businesses in the region. They divorced before I was a teenager, and both of their lives plummeted downhill. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. Drugs, alcohol, and addiction have long since killed them both. Neither of them ever worked a job since I was a teenager. Both of them died homeless before the age of 50. I joined the military and left town without ever looking back. As more years passed, I added more and more distance, physically and mentally, from my parents. When I was 20, I learned that my mother had been arrested for stealing a large sum of money from my grandmother, who was living on her own, but in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. The state ended up pressing charges against my mother, because my grandmother would not. The detective told me that they had to, because my mom and her piece of crap boyfriend were, quote, fueling the criminal underground where she lived. I was lost and shocked. I knew my mother had problems, but until this moment, I had always viewed her as a sort of forest hippie. This is the moment that is the catalyst for my nuclear revenge. You see, my grandmother was pretty wealthy. Terrified that she would be locked away in an old folks' home, she entertained the leeching of my grandmother and piece of crap guy. The problem is that it was never enough. Even after my grandmother bought my mother a house down the street from her, she continued to rob her own mother blind. She also fed my underage sister a stream of drugs and brought her in on the con. It ultimately resulted in my mother and sister getting their first felony conviction, grand theft and fraud, which my mother tried to pin on her own daughter, quote, because she was just a minor. A few years later, I was newly married with my first child and freshly returned from my first deployment to Iraq. We just completed another move across the country, and I'm starting a new job at a new unit. I get home from work and have a strange short voicemail from my uncle, who is like the okayest guy I have ever met. It literally just says, "My mom is in the psych ward at the big hospital in her town. She left everything in your name. I'm flying back home." This is where I learned that the legal document my grandma had me sign when I was 16 made me the executor of her estate, power of attorney, etc. My unit arranges a very generous amount of time off to fly across the country and deal with this bizarre scenario. She lived alone in this massive house. My mom had destroyed the house my grandmother bought her, then moved into grandma's house on the auspices of caring for her. There were so many fleas inside that contractors I hired to make repairs wouldn't go inside. Needles everywhere, and for some reason, everything was an ashtray. It was an insane thing to witness and experience. I still refused to interact with my mom at this point of my life, but now that I had the keys to the kingdom, aka access to the pot of gold, she tried to worm back into my life with a renewed vigor. I always just told her to F off. My grandmother, in the meantime, had been deemed unfit to live on her own. I was 23, with a new baby in marriage, if you remember, so I made the poor decision to put my grandmother into a nursing home. I fixed up the house, rented it to create passive income so she would not deplete her savings, and headed back home. Of course, Grandma is spicy, and got kicked out of her swanky retirement home when she broke a coffee cup over some other lady's head for snooping around in her room. She was apparently wearing my grandmother's shoes when she got clocked. The same woman, a resident, had propositioned me in front of my wife when we were touring the facility. She was a different kind of the same spicy as Grandma. Her only option after the incident was a psych ward, so my senile grandmother moved in with my family. She lived with us for more than 5 years, until her care was just out of our capability. This is about the time that I exacted my revenge. When the state filed charges against my mother back when I was 20, part of her restitution included a lien that was placed against her property in the name of my grandmother for a little less than $100K. Some years later, my mother had not paid her property taxes in so long that she was about to lose the house. She called me to explain that the lien would not be paid if the house was auctioned, which I knew was not true, but I saw an opportunity. I eventually worked out a deal with her. She would sign the deed over to me, and I would then sell the house and pay for her to move somewhere else. I fly to town, meet her, and sign the deed over. She expected me to use my name and credit to get her a luxury apartment. She also wanted me to buy her a new truck, and let's not forget the moving company. I rented her a U-Haul truck and got her a storage unit that I had paid for 6 months. Then I put her and her shithead up in an extended stay for a little while. I fixed up the property and sold it to the same rental group that bought my grandmother's house shortly before. I used the money to buy annuities that enable my grandmother to live in a normal house with a live-in nurse and care at 1:4 ratio, which is amazing for her. She still might run out of money because of what my mother did, and I honestly don't know what will happen then. She's got some years before I have to worry, and she is just shy of 100. My mother was on the street within 6 months. The last time I saw her, she looked like the crazy person who lives under a bridge. She did at one point. She was covered in sores, balding, and methed out. She'd received a Social Security disability back payment of what would have been a significant amount for her. She died in a hospital less than 3 days later, partied herself to death. The piece of crap dropped her off at the curb and never saw her again. I told the dude I would give him some money if he gave me the key to the storage unit. Somehow, years later, she had managed to keep it. I shared the loot with my siblings, gave the piece of crap $100, and closed that chapter of my life permanently. My grandpa's revenge. This isn't my petty revenge story, but my grandpa's. About 15 or more years ago, my grandparents retired and moved to a gated community a couple of blocks from a decent-sized lake. Their house was near Lake Athens, Texas. My grandpa absolutely loves to get out of the house and fish, so retiring close to a lake was an absolute godsend for him. I remember going out on the lake and fishing with him multiple times growing up. He had a tracker boat that he would tow with his old 80ish Chevy truck. Now, just so you know, this wasn't his daily driver. He used it strictly for towing his boat. When not in use, he would park it in a little alcove a few feet away from his driveway, surrounded by trees. Appearance-wise, this truck was not beautiful, and had definitely seen better days, but it was still more than capable of taking his boat to and from the lake, with no problems at all. Fast forward a few months, and he receives a letter from his next-door neighbor. It turns out they hate seeing his old truck, despite it being pretty well covered by trees, and believe it ruins their enjoyment of looking outside their house. In the letter, they have stated that they have contacted the HOA multiple times, with the goal of either finding him until he sells his truck or removes it completely from their view. My grandpa was pissed. He called his HOA to discuss the letter, and it turns out the HOA has shut down all of the neighbors' complaints, but they are persistent and keep sending more. Now here comes the revenge. My grandpa then asks if there would be any repercussions for chopping down a few trees on his property. The trees that oh-so kept his Chevy moderately hidden from his pesky neighbors' peeping eyes. He gets the all clear and begins chopping away. His old beat-up Chevy that was once covered ever so carefully by the trees was now displayed bare in its entirety for the whole world to see. Needless to say, the Grinches next door were not happy to see his truck uncensored. From what I remember, they tried to complain again before deciding to move away. You must have a pretty pathetic life if the sight of someone's old truck is enough to make you pack up and leave. Always good to leave it off on a nice lighthearted one. Thanks a bunch for watching, guys. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, it really helps me out. And also subscribe to the channel for more. And with that, I'm out of here, so have an awesome day everyone, and I'll see you next time.